we are really in a enormous climate emergency. A catastrophe is occurring right now, and it's going to get a lot worse, unfortunately, given our inaction of politicians and countries to do much at all.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. We always like to bring you topical conversations about what's going on in our world and what it may mean in terms of our current warming and what it may mean for our future. And many of you are well aware of the fires that are burning across the globe. Our world is on fire. Our very home is in peril. From Greece to Turkey and to what I'm going to speak about, the American West, our world is burning. Our world is literally going up in flames. California has always been known as America's breadbasket, and in a way, breadbasket to the world. Now that very place where we've been able and safely to grow sustenance is in jeopardy. Fires from the south to the north, from Bakersfield, which is north of LA, to the Chickadee Creek fire, which is right on the Canadian border. Fires are burning. And as a matter of fact, the 2021 current year wildfire season is predicted to be quite high, because 98.5% of the land in the American West is either in moderate to severe drought condition. And as we know, there's nothing that spells tender, and I'm not speaking about the dating app, there's nothing that spells kindling and tender like dry wood, dry leaves, dry pine cones, and we see a lot of that in the West. We see a lot of that in the West because of the beautiful Sierra Nevadas and the wonderful nature that was always an iconic part of the West. So I'm going to speak to you about just a few of the fires that are currently burning and discuss how long they've been burning and how contained they are. One of the biggest fires, and you've probably heard of it already, is the Dixie fire. That fire has been burning for 45 days straight. 753,000 acres as of this filming burned to the ground, and it is still only 46% contained. We have the Caldor fire that's been burning for 23 days at 144,000 acres. And with 144,000 acres already burned, it's still only 8% contained. Now, what's particularly sad about this fire, at least for me, is it's having terrible effects on the Lake Tahoe region. And this is truly a natural gem. I've had the opportunity to be there once in my life. I've always dreamed of going again. If I'm ever to go, what will I find? Seriously, I don't know. But what I do know is that people in that region are suffering greatly. The particulate matter from all this burning is through the roof. And of course, particulate matter, unbridled, such as we see it, is a cause of cardiac events, including heart attack, stroke, and can also cause cancer. So slow death or quick incapacitation through stroke is a result of these fires for many, many people, many people. This region used to be a place of a sacred place. The nomadic tribes, as a matter of fact, the nomadic North American tribes in that region used to go to Lake Tahoe to collect medicinal herbs. As I said, it's a very special ecological place, and a place that was once a place of healing is now a place of great suffering. We also have the Sneider Springs fire that's been burning for 13 days. And in only 13 days, 75,000 acres burned, contained at only 12%. We have the Summit Trail Fire, and it's been burning for 46 days at a rate of 1,000 acres a day. It's for a total of 46,000 acres and less than 50% contained. So as I mentioned, these fires in the American West, all up and down the coast, and they are now, it seems, moving westward. For there's a fire in Idaho and even one in Nevada. So we don't see an end in sight as of yet. And I'm going to turn this over to Paul to see if he can give us an even broader scope of what's happening with these fires around the world. Paul?
Yes, thank you, Regina. So you've mentioned a lot of the fires in the US, including California. And of course, many people remember the town of Paradis, California, which was completely obliterated by a wildfire a few years ago. Since then, we've had massive fires in Australia with images of people fleeing on the coastlines by going onto the beaches and into boats and just wading into the ocean to escape the heat and the flames. And we've had similar images of these type of evacuations from wildfire areas in places like Greece and Turkey and Portugal, Spain. Most recently, there was an island in Greece, which was evacuated by a ferry, and the people are being removed in the ferry, and it's like an apocalyptic nightmare. There's flames everywhere. You know, it's not just in California, as you say, they've been spreading inland and they're also spreading north. I mean, the number of fires burning in BC is, you know, typically approaching 300 at any given time, 270 fires, that sort of thing. And just recently, temperatures reached 49.6 degrees in the interior of BC, and the town of Lytton burned to the ground. Those type of temperatures, you know, that's a new Canadian record. And remember, those are air temperatures. So if you have an air temperature of about 50 degrees, it's likely that the surface of the ground, the soil temperature is even higher, depending on its albedo or reflectivity. It can be, 60 degrees Celsius or 65 degrees Celsius, the temperature right at the surface of the ground. So, you know, these type of fires are becoming more widespread around the world. The jet streams have been slowing and getting stuck in place, and we're getting strong ridges under which there's heat waves, lots of evaporation, and when they're persistent, they're leading to the droughts that you've mentioned. Of course, places like in the Amazon and Africa have tremendous numbers of fires. Many of them are intentionally set in order to clear the forests, in order to have plantations for palm oils and things like that, or for livestock farming. Whenever there's a wildfire, it's a double whammy for the planet, because not only do you eliminate the trees, char and burn down the forests, so you're wrecking the carbon sink, the ability of the land to absorb carbon, but you're also greatly increasing emissions from all of the wood being burned. This year so far, a paper just came out, preliminary, but 4.6 gigatons of carbon has been, of CO2 has been released this year. And this year, you know, we're not even into September yet. We're almost there, but we're only 2/3 of the way into the year. And that represents about 13% of global emissions in a typical year. So, you know, if CO2 levels rise 3 parts per million this year, if that would be from industrial emissions, add, you know, another, say, 15% to that, which is about 0.45 parts per million. So these fires are they're having a large impact on the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere now. Another thing is that many of these fires that have burned trees are burning trees that were planted to offset emissions. You know, if people fly, et cetera, you can get trees planted to offset your emissions. And when they burn down a few years later, that's hardly there's no permanence to that storage of carbon. we're getting, if you talk to people that fight these fires, it's becoming ever more difficult because the fires are burning hotter and they're moving faster, especially crown to crown forest fires, for example. They're generating so much updraft from the heat that it's generating fire tornadoes. There's a video online where you can see these firemen that are pulling a fire hose, which is actually being sucked up into one of these firenadoes, and they're losing the battle. There's about 4 or 5 firemen that are pulling on this hose, which is going not quite vertically, it's going up at about a 60-degree angle into the firenado. These fires are creating their own weather. They're creating pyrocumulonimbus clouds, which are like storm clouds, but there's very little water in a lot of them. Depends on the water content of the wood, which is low if the region's been in a drought. But these pyrocumulonimbus clouds, they suck up embers, which they then cast many kilometers away from the actual fire site. And they also create lightning because of the friction within the clouds, and that lightning can spark fires in other locations. So the more fires there are, the more fires are created by these processes. The other question is, what replaces a forest when it's gone? We assume another forest will grow in that location, but often the climate has changed. There's not enough precipitation and it's hotter. So instead of a forest regrowing, we might have savanna, which is mostly grass and a few odd trees, or grasslands, or in the worst cases, we could get deserts resulting in those regions. Also, the smoke, you've mentioned the direct health problems to people, but there's also the problems of, people worried about something called nuclear winter. Kreutzkin and Carl Sagan said, limited exchange nuclear war would put enough ash and soot into the sky to block the sun enough to cause a global crop failure over several years and a famine. So imagine if all of Canada's forests and Asia's forests, boreal forests, went up in smoke. We'd be in that situation with the nuclear winter. So this is a big concern. We're seeing these forest destruction with the temperature rise, 1.1, 1.2 degrees that we have, and it's going to get a lot worse. How many fires will there be when we're at 2 or 3 degrees warmer? Like, it's unimaginably horrifying, that scenario.
I hate to say thank you, Paul, but thank you, Paul. Yeah, I pyrocumulonimbus. Okay, that's a new one for me to play on Scrapple. But really, it's not funny. I'm trying to make, we deal with these situations as best we can, and there's just so much that you said and so much to digest. And truly, the firefighters, the firemen out there, I can't imagine what they're going through. We have, I hate to say it, we have so many wars on so many fronts, and just fighting these fires has got to be just an unbelievable experience. And my hat's off to those who are able to do this. It's got to be incredibly difficult. So, Peter, I'm wondering what you have to say about these horrifying fires. And I'm particularly interested, and I'm not sure you'll be able to address this, but I do recall, I believe one time you said that the latest IPCC report does not factor in feedback effects from, for example, maybe even these fires. So I'm wondering if that has if that's something you can speak to, or whatever else you have in your mind.
So yes, Regina, you're absolutely right. And the fact that the IPCC does not include forest feedback in general, and the feedback from the increasing worldwide forest fires, they don't include that feedback. With respect to the IPCC, we've just had this 6th assessment working group 1 out, but that doesn't have a lot to say about fires because fires comes out in working group 2. Right now I'm looking at a fire map projection, a projection of fire probability and frequency, which was published by the 2014 fifth assessment. When I look at this map, I see feedbacks, because when forests burn, as Paul has explained, they emit carbon dioxide, and they emit a lot of carbon dioxide. So the top three global warming emissions are CO2, methane, black carbon soot, and when forests burn, they emit all three. Now, as the IPCC Working Group 1 science report said, if we don't put emissions into immediate, rapid, large-scale, quote, decline, we will not be able to prevent the danger limit, the disastrous danger limit of 1.5 degrees C, and we may not be able to avoid 2 degrees C. So here I am looking at this map, and more than half of the land areas in the world are covered in shades of red, indicating increased probability of fires in those regions. So Regina shared with us the horrible, terrible situation in the Western United States, which has also spread right up to Canada because of the extreme heat and also the drying. There is drought right up the West Coast, and that drought is now moving centrally into Western Canada. So the IPCC now talks fire weather, and that's simply based on what is pretty obvious, extreme heat and drying. And if you have forests there, up they go. So the probability at 1.8 degrees C involves the west and central United States and up into the west of Canada. So I'm looking at 2/3 of the United States experiencing more forest fires and worse forest fires. When I look across to Europe, I see the same thing in Western Europe and Southern Europe. Now, we're already seeing those fires as well as we're seeing, of course, in the Western US. So you can imagine that we're at 1.2 degrees C. So you can imagine what's going to happen at actual 2 degrees C. So, of course, we have these record fires in Greece again, in Turkey again, and as well as in the Western US, we have record unprecedented fires. Now, I should point out that these horrendous, unprecedented record fires, these have only actually started in the past few years. So there's been a huge change at 1.2 degrees C in the world burning up. Now, here's the next shock. The entire area of Asia, Siberia, and Eastern Europe is covered in shades of red when I look at this map. So that entire landmass at 2 degrees C is going to have more fires, and they're going to be more intense. Northern India, deep, deep red. There's going to be huge, huge fires in Northern India, which will be a change at 2 degrees C. Southern Africa, red. Eastern Africa, red. All of Australia, red and deep red. So Regina mentioned, and I'm so glad she did, that these are not just fires that burn up people's homes, which is bad enough. They burn up the homes of all of the wonderful species, the high biodiversity that lives in these forests. And that's truly, truly a global warming holocaust. And that's going to get worse and worse. Done.
Thank you so much, Peter. I really, really want to thank you for bringing up the other living beings with whom we share this planet, because it's something that just so often goes unsaid. You know, we hear the tally of the homes that are destroyed, as you mentioned, the people who lost their family photos, those who had to move from their home that was passed from generation. But once a species is gone, it's gone forever. And as we saw in 2020 in Australia, we have to think back. It seems like forever ago, but it's 2020 in Australia. Close to 3 billion animals were killed.
Yeah.
Unfathomable numbers, unfathomable. And absolutely, I completely wanted to reiterate, Peter, what you said about how these massive fires are something so new. So I have in my notes here that in 1983, a little over 1 million acres were burned due to wildfires. In 84, the same. 85, it moved up to 2 million. But as you see, we're now up to 10 million. Last year, 10 million acres burned. 2017, 10 million. 2015, 10 million. So we can see that there is a trend of more and more acreage burning, more and more animals losing their lives, more and more suffering for humans. And Paul, is there an end in sight? What can we expect?
Wildfires around the world are obviously one of the most severest consequences of our rapidly warming world. You know, this is why I'm always trying to talk about the climate system and, you know, the abrupt climate system change, not just, you know, the atmospheric changes. So with all of these things happening on land, these fires, I think that really emphasizes the importance of the carbon sinks that are in the oceans, because, you know, you have phytoplankton blooms capturing huge amounts of carbon, and they're not going to go up in smoke. And already the ocean draws in an enormous amount of carbon. So the wildfires are clearly threatening the terrestrial sinks, the sinks of carbon on land, you know, whether it be grasslands or forests, you know, any sort of vegetation, of course, any plant, via photosynthesis, it absorbs CO2, takes the carbon, separates the molecules, the oxygen is released into the air for us to breathe, and the carbon is incorporated into the plant matter. So, you know, the oceans cover 70% of the surface, and I think that the sinks in the ocean are going to become that much more important. And we need humanity to put the engineers and scientists to work on ways to draw down carbon, because, you know, this is clearly an emergency, and if we wait longer and longer, we're going to have a, you know, more and more risk of losing, you know, like as bad as the forests are, you know, they cover a large part of the planet. And if you look at the percentage of the forests, the area of the forests that are burning compared to the areas of the forests that are not burning, it's still you know, a fairly small percent, but that percent is growing ever more. And when it reaches 10, 20, 50, 100%, we're into one of these so-called nuclear winter scenarios if it happens quickly. And the particulate matter from the wildfires is greatly exacerbating the air pollution problem. Even today, 8.7 million people around the planet succumb to air pollution, mostly the PM 2.5, the very smallest particles of air pollution. And there's lots of that produced in wildfire smoke. So we are really in a enormous climate emergency. A catastrophe is occurring right now, and you know, it's going to get a lot worse, unfortunately, given our inaction of politicians and countries to do much at all. You know, they're still subsidizing fossil fuel companies to the tune of trillions of dollars. So that's got to stop. It's just killing us.
Yeah, it's definitely got to stop, Paul. But I mean, what's going to make it stop? And the thing that I just find so infuriating is we're subsidizing them, but that means you, me, Peter, Charles, and Heidi on the production side of this, we're all working so that our taxes can go to fuel an industry that's killing our planet and as well as us. The irony is now lost. It's truly horrifying. Peter, what are your thoughts? I know that you have very strong thoughts about the fossil fuel industry and the injustice that they're perpetrating on this world.
Well, I think with this Working Group 1 report, I think that what I've tended to say in the past is pretty accurate. burning fossil fuels is literally burning up the planet. Burning fossil fuels is burning up our forests. But worse than that, burning fossil fuels is burning up the food for all the world's children and all future generations. So continuing to burn fossil fuels and for governments to continue to push and subsidize fossil fuel combustion, which is burning up the planet, is clearly the crime of all time. And from my point of view, is the greatest, worst human evil ever or ever imaginable. Now, I want to follow up on the very important point that Paul brought up, which was carbon sinks. There were a lot of very different, very shocking, frightening findings, definite findings by this Working Group 1 AR6 report. And one of them was a complete change in their projection of what's going to happen with carbon sinks. The IPCC, using, of course, their computer models, up to this report, had told us that the land carbon sinks, in other words, the forests would be pretty well okay until the end of the century, and that for hundreds of years, the ocean carbon sink will be okay. Not the case in this report, because the models have caught up more with the real world. The land carbon sink is going to go into decline. It's going to become less efficient. Well, that's not surprising, because we know that we have extreme heat and drying and forest fires, in all the regions where we have our most important forests, including the Amazon and the boreal. The boreal being by far the biggest forest in the world, circumpolar, includes northern Canada, and most importantly includes Siberia. That carbon sink is clearly weakening because of these three factors, and the models now confirm it. And in decades, that carbon sink, which has been buffering to a large extent all of our fossil fuel emissions that, thanks to our governments and the corporate industry, have been pouring out. You know, this is a constant thing. It happens every day, you know, every second. We're burning fossil fuels and pouring out CO2 and methane as well. So we're going to lose that sink. And the Working Group 1 points out and has an excellent diagram of showing that with each progressive increase in global warming, there's going to be somewhat more carbon drawn up by the forests, because the forests have been greening up, but there will be more each time, more carbon dioxide left in the atmosphere. So we're now looking at another level of today's already accelerating global warming from the failing carbon sinks. And the IPCC says now that this century, even the ocean carbon sinks will start to lose efficiency. This is absolutely, absolutely terrifying. I mean, it really, really is. Because the only thing that's sort of keeping the planet from not, you know, virtually totally burning up, as Paul's talking about, is that we are having these carbon sinks. They're not actually carbon sinks, they're temporary storages. And the forests are the great carbon warehouses of the world. And allowing the forest to continue to dry out, to be stressed with extreme heat. Oh, and by the way, all this was in the last assessment in 2014. All of these impacts on the forest were documented in that assessment. So the impacts in the sense of drying and heat, they're not new. They've been going on and increasing a very long time.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you as well, Paul. This has been a very interesting topic, and I really appreciate learning about the fire NATOs. I didn't know as much about them as I do now. And thank you, Peter, for educating us on the importance of feedback loops with all of these fires. So it's a lot of information to take in, and I'm glad that you've spent this time with us. If you're wondering, gee, what can I do? This is all too much. There's not a lot, but there is a lot, because everything that we do does count. So avoiding palm oil, avoiding beef as much as possible, and a great number of fires, at least in the United States, are started by people. So being careful and foregoing that McBurger, because you know what, it's killing the planet and it's harmful for the human body as well. So I hope that you learned something from today's discussion. Hope you've taken away something that you can share with your friends. And by the way, please share this video to someone who might want to learn more about forest fires, and go ahead and give us a thumbs up. And while you're at it, why not subscribe? We'd love to make sure that you're with us the next time we meet for the Climate Emergency Forum.